Great. It is great to have Melissa Dell with us today from Harvard. She's a professor at the Department of Economics there. She's a PhD from MIT Econ, and she has been doing like a lot of exciting research in like economic growth, political economy, economic history, the union and intersection of all these things, and she's a Rhodes Scholar and a junior fellow from the Harvard Center Fellow. And yes, we are very happy to have you here. Thank you so much. Yes, welcome.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. So I'm going to be talking today about a new initiative to automate the digitization of historical data on a large scale. So this is a little bit different than what a typical economics talk would be. Rather than talking about a specific question that we try to answer, it's more about developing methods that will help researchers to extract data more generally. And so the broad motivation is that many of the biggest challenges that our society faces today have their roots in the past, and a long-run perspective can provide fundamental insights into what are the causes of these challenges, what are potential solutions, and more generally can help us to understand a variety of different economic, social, and political phenomena. So there's been a huge literature in economics over the past 20 years thinking about the historical roots of underdevelopment, about opportunity and mobility across time, etc. But vast amounts of data that could shed light on important open questions remain locked in hard copy due to prohibitive curation costs. And in particular, these costs can be particularly prohibitive when the data is at the individual or the firm level. And well, if you want to study questions like social mobility, what allows some people to be more mobile than others, some communities to have more mobility than others. If you want to think about the misallocation of the factors of production across firms, which people in economics over the past decade have increasingly realized is a big issue in thinking about economic development, et cetera, you need to have data that's at the firm level or at the individual level. These are very difficult questions to study with aggregated data. And yet most studies of long-run questions rely on aggregated data because it's much cheaper to manually digitize. So just to briefly summarize for those of you who haven't worked with these data types, the status quo, if you need a data set that you can't just go and download online, is to manually digitize the data set. So you might send it to India or to Cambodia. You might have two different firms digitize it and then try to reconcile the differences. And the challenges here are multifold. It's expensive, it's slow, and if you have a large data set, you're going to have a very difficult time, even if you have a large budget, because the way that these data entry firms work is they hire freelancers, and the larger the data set you send them, they're going to hire lower and lower quality freelancers, and you will notice a deterioration in the quality of the digitization. Beyond that, when you get the data back, there's a lot of further cleaning work that needs to be done to convert that into a structured database that you can use for data analyses. And each research team effectively develops its own tools and its own pipeline to do that. And because this is a very costly process, typically an individual research team will extract only the information they need to answer a very specific question. And so even if a data set could be very, very useful to the research community in general, it may just be that certain fragments of it are digitized. It's not clear exactly which parts the research team digitized. And so that makes it very difficult to have the data used by a variety of different researchers who ideally could use it to shed light on important questions. And so moving forward, I think now is a really exciting time to be an applied social scientist because advances in data science have the potential to facilitate data digitization on a previously unimaginable scale. Much of this data is locked in hard copy format or an image format. Some huge percentage of the internet is in image data. And we're now, for the first time, having kind of the methods, the tools that we need to develop methods for unlocking that data on a large scale. And if done well, this could lower costs of digitization and also reduce error rates. And so in particular, I'm going to be focusing today on applying these methods to tabular and semi-structured data, which is the type of data that's most often useful for people in economics and also to some extent in other sciences. And this is very different than the digital humanities, where oftentimes they're using books, right, which is a completely different format, and we'll talk about why that matters. Also, there's scope for open access collaboration to correct inevitable digitization errors if there's a particularly valuable data set that many research teams would like to use. Right now, we don't have really mechanisms for them to be able to collaborate, but we're working on building those. And so the key thing is that while these tools have increasingly become available that one could imagine applying to this problem, the synthesis of methodology that we need to digitize historical structured data is not available off the shelf. And so commercial OCR software is largely incapable of understanding the layouts of most structured historical documents that would be of interest to economists, political scientists, et cetera. Complex layouts are very common in these types of publications. Whereas if you're working in the digital humanities, where a lot of this research has happened, usually you have a book. It reads from left to right, or right to left, or top to bottom. And extracting the structures is not so important. They're more concerned about recognizing ancient languages, natural language processing, et cetera. Whereas for us, we're trying to extract data, and it's going to be in a particular structured format. And so I'm going to be very focused today on how we recognize and extract those layouts. And moreover, once the data is digitized, you have to convert it from the format that it's originally in a given publication into a database that you can take and that you can analyze. There's also not off-the-shelf tools to do that. And so essentially what I've been focused on is creating a three-pronged set of public goods to facilitate data digitization. So first of all, open source tools that facilitate document layout analysis and character recognition. And I'll talk about that both for semi-structured data and for tabular data. Second, methods to convert digitized data into structured databases. And third, an open source cloud platform that we're working to develop that can be used to identify and correct data entry errors. Okay, so I became interested in these methods when working on a project with Sahar Parsa, who's at NYU, where we needed to digitize more data than we could ever possibly digitize by hand. We have very rich historical data for Japan that we'd like to use to look at a variety of economic questions about how Japan became very economically successful in the 20th century. But there's hundreds of thousands of pages. Even if we had an infinite budget, we're not going to find a labor force in Japan that's capable of digitizing all that data. And so here's just some examples. So this is firm-level data. It contains information from balance sheets, information about the personnel of Japanese firms. Historically, this is a very similar publication that also has firm-level data. There's about 30,000 firms per volume. Volumes are published annually, and it has a bunch of information from their balance sheets, about their board of directors, who are their suppliers, their customers, what are their banks, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, a third source that's very important for us is biographical data about prominent Japanese individuals. So we have about 50,000 individual biographies per year. This is called the Who's Who of Japan. We can find most prominent business leaders in there and learn a lot about their occupational histories, their education, their experience in government, et cetera, et cetera. And combined with the firm-level data, this gives us a lot of very rich information about who is running these firms, which we ultimately want to use for a project that's seeking to understand the role of management and human capital in Japan's economic success. And so that kind of is what got me interested, but this project is about, far more than just these data, and we want to expand the methods more broadly. So before I go into the details, I also just wanted to briefly recognize the team of people. And so as I mentioned, our test case has been for an actual project that we're working on and trying to extract the data for. We're working with an engineering firm called the Agile Monkeys to design an open source cloud platform that will facilitate correcting and collaborating on digitized historical data. We have a team of pre-docs, seed funding provided by Harvard, and so it's really been a very collaborative effort, and really central to the project is that we want to involve more researchers, more data sets, more funders over time, so it can become a much bigger initiative to broaden and democratize access to historical data and can reduce some of the inefficient costs that researchers pay when they discover I really need this data set to look at a question that I'm interested in, but I don't have any idea how to go about digitizing this. Okay, and so I'm going to talk about two different types of data that we've worked on processing. So semi-structured data and then tabular data. Within each of these types of data, you have different essentially steps to being able to convert raw image scans into a structured database. So you need to understand the layout, you need character recognition, and then you need to extract information and convert that into structured, clean databases. And so I'm going to talk about those methodologies, and then I'll briefly introduce you to our collaborative platform at the end, which provides a way to disseminate this data and to encourage more researchers to get involved in the project. Okay, so first of all, to talk about semi-structured data. And so let me outline, first of all, the problem. And so a variety of data sets that social scientists would like to use to study important questions are in the form of semi-structured data. And so one example is the biographies of individuals that I just showed you, which will form our test case. But there's also lots of other examples. So historical newspapers would be an example of semi-structured data. Again, if you just put those into commercial OCR software, it's going to be a disaster because it can't recognize the very specific layouts. And we could learn an enormous amount from historical newspapers. How does political polarization and media coverage change in the US across time, et cetera, et cetera. Historical patent data is another big one that economists would love to work with. But people have manually digitized bits of it here and there, but there's never really been an effort to systematically digitize all of that, except Google put them all into their OCR software, and the output is unusable, basically. And so there is no sort of usable general data set of historical patent data, and we've talked with researchers about developing that. And one could, give additional examples. But there's a lot of fascinating information contained in these types of semi-structured data.
Digitization wasn't.
You're going to see that. It's gonna be very evident. But very, very important question. Okay, and so this is going to be our test case that I'm going to use to illustrate the methods. And so these are data from the who's who of Japan. Figure A is an overview of what a page in the book looks like. There's multiple rows, and within a row, the text is written vertically from top to bottom. And then you'll see a specific row of the scan in figure B, while figure C shows a biography for a given individual. And there's 3 different types of text regions that are highlighted with different colors. And so the green is the individual's name, the pink is their position, and the orange is their biography. And essentially, the entire publication is going to consist of blocks like this, where it gives the individual's name and their position, and that's like a header, and then it has a biography with far more detailed information. It does it for that person. And then you move over in the row and do it for the next person, and then you wrap around to the next column. And so this is an example of semi-structured data, and we'd like to extract a variety of information from this. And so essentially, we take the raw image, and we need to be able to recognize that there's different types of text blocks that contain different information. And the ultimate goal is to extract that into a database where for each individual we know certain characteristics like their birthplace, their university, their major, their occupational history, et cetera. And we're ultimately going to use that for economic analysis. So that's where we're going. And off-the-shelf OCR programs are going to perform very poorly. If you just insert, essentially, this raw page in them, or even the column that you see in B, or even this smaller block in C. And what's the reason for that? First of all, the typesetting is complicated. The texts are written vertically while the blocks are placed horizontally. And so that's a problem that's a bit specific to this publication. But even in a newspaper, you imagine seeing something similar where there's lots of narrow columns that go from top to bottom. And then you have text written from left to right. So this sort of layout is very general. And then text sparsity. So text sparsity also leads to surprisingly poor OCR results across commercial OCR softwares. Doesn't matter, you use Google, you use Abby, and that's because they're trained on books, which is a very dense form of text. And so if anything's even a little bit sparse, and you're going to see examples of this, it leads to poor performance. The software may fail to recognize portions of the text altogether. More generally, OCR software is not going to use the layout as a hint for estimating what type of text is contained in the image. In other words, they do character recognition, they don't do layout understanding. And so if you just take and put this into Google Cloud Vision, which we've tested a lot of OCR softwares, and Google performs the best, essentially the output that you get out is a mess. It's not capable of understanding the layout. And as a result of that, it's going to fail to even OCR entire regions of the page, because it just can't figure out what the layout is. As a result, it can't figure out where the text is, and it does very poorly. OK, so what's our approach? Let me first of all give you an overview. So essentially, we need to be able, first of all, to figure out the layout. We want to figure out the bounding boxes and content type for different types of text and different text regions. Then we'll crop these different image segments, recombine them, and send them to OCR. And finally, extract information from the OCR string segments and store them for further use. And so I'll illustrate each of these steps in more detail now. And so the first part is the layout understanding. And so in short, you see our raw input on the left. This is what a high-quality scan of this publication would look at. And on the right is the ideal layout understanding. And so you'll see on the left that there could be irrelevant regions. In that case, this is just the margins of the page. You might imagine that in a newspaper, you would have lots of advertisements that you want to get rid of, et cetera. In any case, in parts of the page, you have information that's irrelevant, and you need to crop those out. The image was also skewed during scanning. Even though we took off the binding to scan this, it still ends up being a little bit skewed. Whereas figure B is an ideal output, where the irrelevant region has been cropped. The skewness is corrected. And the text blocks are marked with different colors. And so you can see the person's name is marked with red, and their position with black, and their biography with blue. And so we know what each text region contains. And so you might think the most naive approach to be able to achieve the layout recognition that you see on the right is just to use a simple rule-based algorithm with thresholding. And the reason why that's not going to work as ideally as you'd like is the spacing isn't even throughout the book. And so there's spacing between biography blocks, and there's also spacing within the block between a person's position and name and their own biography. And it's not always the case that the spacing between blocks is greater than the spacing within the blocks for a given individual, or that that is greater than the spacing between lines. And so just having a very simple rule will not necessarily work. This is where deep learning comes in. But for deep learning, you need a lot of labeled data, and that forms another obstacle because labeling data is costly. And so essentially, our solution is to develop a semi-rule-based algorithm that can achieve satisfactory accuracy in detecting the blocks and in classifying them. And so first of all, we use a rule-based algorithm, then we manually review the outputs generated by it, and we use the corrected labels to train a deep learning pipeline and optimize the accuracy. So let me illustrate this with a figure. So first of all, we need to detect the content region, crop out irrelevant areas, and remove the skewness. So do some essential pre-processing. Then based on the cleaned image, we'll first segment it into rows using the large horizontal gaps that appear between the rows. And then for each of the extracted row regions, we can segment that into different text blocks within a row, just using very standard computer vision tools, RLSA, connected component analysis. And some parameters for this have to be hard-coded. And so then we have the rule-based segmentation. And then we use CNN, a convolutional neural network, for classifying the different types of blocks. And so there's the title blocks, which are shown in orange in the figure, which contain the person's name and position. And then there's the biography blocks that contain their biography in blue. And then you see an additional green block there in that figure that represents a problematic class for blocks that have been wrongly segmented by the rule-based algorithm. The classifier helps to identify this problem. And then finally, depending on the classification results, we can further process the blocks. We can send the problematic ones for resegmentation, and split the title region, which contains both the name and position, into separate name and position blocks. And so in general, this gives us a satisfactory layout understanding of the publication. And so you see examples here. It does pretty well. It's not 100% perfect. There's some irregularities that can affect it, but by and large, it works pretty well for our purposes. And you know, we could always do more. We can manually correct the results generated by the algorithm and train another deep neural network with the labeled data. But in general, this works pretty well. OK, so now we have the layout understanding. The next thing that we need to do is improve OCR accuracy. So I've already told you that commercial OCR software tends to perform poorly. The software performs much better when it's applied to single blocks where the layout is simple. Because if there's a complicated layout, that's going to affect its character recognition capacity. But the problem with this is that there's 100 blocks per page. And if we send them individually, that'll be around 0.3 million API calls for a single book. We have a bunch of books. That's going to be very expensive, very slow. And so we need to reduce the number of API calls to the Google Cloud Vision API while maintaining a similar accuracy. Yep. Yep.
It seems to me that in this example you have the long biography on the left, right, then the name and the short biography. Always like that. This is kind of the...
Most of the time, there are some individuals where they don't have a biography block. It just has their name and position because they didn't have the information.
You're not using this knowledge directly in what you're doing, right? That the information comes in this way?
No, because there's not always a biography block. But you'll see when I talk about tabular data next that in that case, we do heavily use the structure. OK. And so more generally, we want to be able to improve OCR accuracy. You know, we're ultimately going to be using this to merge individuals in this publication with names of individual managers and board members from other publications. And if we have a bunch of OCR errors, it's really going to affect the accuracy and the power that we have to do analysis. And so we want to get things as accurate as possible. So we have all these text blocks that we've detected, and we need to recombine them in a way that maximizes OCR accuracy. And in order to do that, we need to recombine them in a way that keeps the layouts very simple. Because remember, the OCR software has been entirely optimized to OCR books. And it's going to do very poorly on anything that essentially doesn't look like like text in a book. And so we merge different blocks in different ways in order to maximize the accuracy of the OCR software. And this is a very useful kind of general principle regardless of what your blocks look like. So for the biography blocks, we just horizontally stack the blocks from multiple images. And since all the texts are written vertically, OCR can nicely adapt to the merged image, and it outputs fairly accurate results. And so when you have these nice square blocks, you can just stack them, and that's very straightforward. Now the title block illustrates another weakness of OCR softwares, which is that it performs very poorly if characters are sparsely spaced. So you see the name there, it has 3 characters, and the 3 characters of the name are not perfectly evenly spaced. That will actually lead, if you just put in that block, that's the second one on the left, into Google Cloud Vision, it will fail to recognize the 3rd character in that name because it sees uneven spacing, and that really confuses it, and it does poorly. So first of all, we need to vertically stack the characters and individuals' names, and so that they're all the same distance apart. And then we further vertically stack those blocks, and so that it's one long strip, which again is a very simple layout. You feed that into the commercial OCR software, and it does quite well. And then finally, for the position blocks that give the individuals the title of their position, we vertically stack them, and then we horizontally stack those, and that's going to yield images that essentially mimic what the biography blocks look like. And again, that's a very simple layout, and this will maximize the accuracy of the OCR software. And so the bottom line is that we need to recognize the structures ourselves. We don't want to design our own character recognition system and reinvent, what Google has done. And since it's proprietary, we don't know exactly what they do. But in kind of reverse engineering it, it becomes very clear that when you send text to be OCR'd, you need to make it essentially be dense, not sparse, and have a layout that will mimic a book, because that's what their whole software is heavily trained around. We can do other things to improve accuracy. So for example, this publication has an index, which is typically the case with publications that have structured or semi-structured data. And so we can also OCR the index and retain the individual's names from both the index and from the text itself to help us improve accuracy. Okay, and finally, we need to extract information. And kind of in the interest of time, I'm just going to very briefly summarize our methods here. And then I want to move on to talking about tabular data. This is a portion of the project that's still in progress, but that also draws on a lot of existing tools in natural language processing. And so essentially here you see the biography blocks, and they contain different types of information that we're interested in, like the individual's birth year or the year they got their degree, where they got their education, which is going to be very important for thinking about networks of elites in the society, their occupation history, family members' names, et cetera. And we want to extract these different types of information from their biography blocks. 2 challenges: there's noise in the OCR output, and then there's the language issue, which is a bit specific to this example, but oftentimes as social scientists, we do want to study places that aren't Western countries, Compared to English, the currently available NLP tools for Japanese are limited. And there's a lot of linguistic differences, so transfer learning does not work nearly as well as it would if you were, say, going from English to Spanish. And so essentially, what we plan to do is to use part of speech tagging to assign a tag to different parts of a sentence. And we can use that to estimate the attributes of different words. And then we can label some data and train an RNN to predict such labels in a recursive manner. And there's also been, some state-of-the-art NLP tools that have been applied to Japanese, and so that's potentially something to experiment with. So I'm not going to say much about this today because I want to have time to also talk about what we're doing with the more structured tables, but essentially what we have here is an NLP task where now we have these biographies and we need to extract information, and this is going to look a lot more like kind of standard NLP tasks that we've seen in the literature. Okay, and so that's the summary of extracting information from semi-structured data. Of course, as economists, we love tables, and a lot of the historical information that we'd like to digitize is in tabular format. And so let me talk now about what we've done for method development for extracting information from tables on a large scale. And so again, to set up the problem, this is an example publication. This publication contains information about the personnel and the balance sheets and customers, banks, suppliers, et cetera, of around 10,000 Japanese firms annually. And so you can see here the types of information that it contains. You can see in the way that the publication is set up is the large font is the company name, and then you have information about that company underneath it, and there's multiple companies per page. And so before I delve into the details, let me give a broad overview of the comparison between the two pipelines. And so in both cases, we're going to need to understand the layout. I mean, this layout for the tables is even more complicated than the layout for the semi-structured data. And so if you just were to feed this into OCR software, again, it's going to really struggle. And so in both cases, we use a semi-rule-based algorithm to determine the layouts. In the previous example, blocks, the biography blocks, the name blocks, the position blocks were the fundamental unit. In this case, it's going to be rows of the table. In the previous example, we recombined images by class, whether they were a biography block, a name block, or a position block. Here, we're going to send column images, and I'll talk about why we do that. And here, this relates to the question from before. The sequence in which information tends to appear in tables is going to be very important for us to help us to classify different blocks, which in this case are rows of the table. So let me give a broad overview of the pipeline. We start out with a scan, and we're going to segment that into columns. We're going to send those columns to commercial OCR software, and then we're going to ourselves segment the columns into rows and classify what's in each row. Then we can combine that classification with the OCR output to generate a final result. And so one advantage of this pipeline is that our row segmentation and classification is independent from the OCR, and you're going to see that this gives us a lot of independent sources of information whereby we can fix inevitable OCR errors using information from our segmentation and classification and vice versa. So for example, variable names in these tables oftentimes contain special characters that are commonly misdetected by OCR software, and in fact, we can infer what those variables should be from our classification results. As long as either the OCR or the classification is correct, we're often able to infer and fix what the error is, and I'll show you specific examples of that. So let me first talk about the layout understanding and the character recognition, and then I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about how we build structured data from the digitized output. Okay, And so this is, again, the overview of our pipeline. And so we start with a raw image scan, and you'll see that in column in A. And then in figure B, you see that we segment this into individual rows of tables. And so the large font is the company name. Below that, there's an address. And then there's various rows with information. And so you see a broad level classification of what is contained in each of these tables in C, where we've classified the information. The red is the company name. You see under that in green the address, and then you see variable names and variable values, and then those purple blocks are personnel. And so the first thing that we need to do is to segment these into columns, which is very straightforward, similar to the method that we used in the semi-structured data, and into rows. And so in order to segment into rows, we will binarize the column images and count the number of pixels, which you see in figure B. And then we want to estimate row-level bounding boxes, which you see shown in the figure C. As with the previous example, right, you might be tempted just to use a simple rule just to create bounding boxes, essentially by thresholding the signal that you see here. But again, that can lead to unsatisfactory results, and so we need to do something a little bit more sophisticated to get a satisfactory row segmentation. So here, if you can see on the left, at the bottom of that left image, you see an example of undersegmentation. And so you can see that the image is really skewed at the bottom corner, which is common when you have a fat book and you're trying to press it down to scan. And so that leads those rows to be undersegmented. On the other hand, on the right, you see an example of oversegmentation. So this is one row of the table. This is a personnel, their position and their name. And their position gets text strapped onto 3 lines. And then the name is centered next to the position. And it gets oversegmented. So this position gets put in 2 separate rows, which is also going to create a problem. And this, as you can see, is inherent to the complex sort of layout of this publication. Text and tables can be justified and centered in all sorts of different ways. And in order to read the table, we need to be able to infer what is a row in the table. And so a more satisfactory approach is that, first of all, we threshold the signal to obtain an initial row segmentation. And then we compute the median height of rows. And if a row is, has a very small height relative to the median height, we say that it's undersegmented, and we merge it to its nearest row. And so that takes care of this problem up here on the top. This problem on the top. And whereas if the row is very wide relative to the median height, we say it's oversegmented. We rotate it because it's the skewness that you see here that's causing it to be undersegmented. And then we repeat this process until we get the max number of rows. And that's going to largely take care of issues like this, where there's undersegmentation. And so you can see in this figure on the left is the naive method, where we just use a simple thresholding rule. And on the right is the more complex method, where we adjust for over and under segmentation. And the slightly more complex method leads to much more satisfactory results. OK. And so next, let me say a brief word about character recognition. And again, this is going to be a little bit analogous to what I talked about with the semi-structured data. And so you need to manipulate the block layouts to an extent to improve character detection. And so in particular, Google Cloud Vision is going to fail when there's sparsity, just like that example with the person's name that I showed you previously. If characters are spaced like even a little bit apart or not evenly spaced, it really screws it up. It may not detect the characters at all. It can also fail if the text is both perfectly aligned horizontally and vertically. Then it doesn't know which way the text should go, and it may duplicate the characters. And so this is an example of the misdetection of personnel names. So again, these are names of people, the first name and the last name, and the bounding boxes are shown around the characters. And you see in that middle column, there's 5 rows where it just fails to detect one character of the name, and that's because there's spaces here. And commercial OCR software doesn't like the spaces. And it also may get confused that these are perfectly aligned, going both this way and this way. And so how do we fix that? We can move the characters and the names closer together, just like we did before, and it's going to do much better. Okay, so again, the lesson, if you're you sort of wanting to use commercial OCR software, is make whatever you put in look like it's a book. Okay, now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the classification problem. And so this publication contains broad classes of information, like the company name, address, its balance sheet, a variable name, variable value, personnel. But it also contains very specific information. What's the net profit or the total assets of the firms? Who are its banks? Who are its customers? And the visual signatures of the broad classes are quite distinct. You don't have to read a word of Japanese to look at this and tell that the company name is the one with big, bold font, and the address is right under it, and then variable names are circled, and the personnel is the block at the bottom with a very specific structure with people's names and positions. Even if you don't know a single character in Japanese, you can recognize that the variable names, they look a bit more similar, and so we're going to treat those separately. So first of all, we'll classify row images into broad classes using deep learning on the image data. And because the images look very distinct, it doesn't take too much training data to make this work. And then we're going to classify row images into detailed variable classes using a lot of different information. So we'll use semantic information from the text. We'll use the structure of the tables. We'll use the broad labels from the deep learning model. We'll use output from Google Cloud Vision, et cetera. And I'll talk about how we combine those. And these are largely independent. And so this helps us not just to label what's contained in every row, but to detect errors that could ultimately lead to biases in our analysis. We want the data to be as accurate as possible. This also yields extensive labeled data that could potentially be used to train a deep learning model on all rows and be applied to other publications, other years of this publication in the future. So let me talk about the broad classification. We want to achieve essentially what you see in figure C, where we figure out what's a company name, what's an address, what's a variable name, variable value, et cetera, which you can see here. So you see that's an example of a balance sheet, personnel, company, address, the variable, which start with those circled letters, the variable value, and you can see they look very distinct. And so in brief, we can use a convolutional neural network along with a conditional random field to classify each row image. And so essentially what the CNN does is just to take each image and independently classify what sorts of information it contains. But there's also a lot of information in the structure of this publication. A company name is followed by certain types by an address, but not by a variable, right? And we can use that structure of information as well to improve the classification. And so essentially what the conditional random field does is that it takes into account not just independently how to classify the image, classifying independent images, but also takes the sequence, the pairwise sequence of images, and runs the model on that. And so we don't allow an address to follow personnel because that doesn't happen in the publication, right? The transition probability of that is 0, whereas whereas we oftentimes see like personnel following balance sheet, and so we know that it has to work like that. And so the technical details aren't too important, but that's the general intuition that we can use the structure of the publication to improve the classification from the neural network. So that gives us a broad classification, but if we want to use this data to answer economic questions, we need a firm-level data set where we know what each variable contained in the table is. And so essentially, the way that we need to go from output that looks like it does in the book to a data set that you could import into R and analyze what the net assets of the firm are and how they're affected by your treatment variable, et cetera. And so to do that, we're going to pre-process the digitized output. Then we are going to label what rows contain specific variables. We're going to remove incorrect row labels and add missing row labels. And then finally, we'll convert the data from the row level format to which it appears in the book to a firm level data set in clean variable values. About what?
Boundary conditions.
In this specifically?
Markup random fields, as I understand.
Yeah, so it's looking at the pairwise transition between different variables for a firm, but we also know that the last line for a given firm, unless it's the first or the last in the book, is followed by another firm. And so if personnel in that particular year is the last variable to appear for a firm, we know that that should be followed by the name of another firm, unless it's at the, the last firm in the book. OK. And so just to give an overview, we'll start out by pre-processing the digitized output. And so essentially, Google Cloud Vision, as I mentioned, cannot recognize layouts. And so what it gives us that's useful is character level data. It tells us each character, its bounding box, and the confidence that Google Cloud Vision has that it's correctly OCR'd that character. And we're going to combine that with the row level bounding boxes that we calculated ourselves to aggregate input to the row level. And we're going to also pass along some of this character level information down the pipeline because it's very useful for cleaning and labeling the output. And so let me give you some examples of how the character level output is useful. And in particular, we're going to have symbol level bounding boxes that help us to correctly wrap text that's wrapped within a table. If we have a row that we recognize where Google Cloud Vision doesn't recognize any characters at all, we know that it's failed to detect characters, and we can potentially use that information to infer what should be there. Symbol level confidence scores. If Google Cloud Vision is not very confident that it got the character correct, that's oftentimes indicative that there shouldn't even be a character there. And that's very useful for us in our data cleaning as well. So let me just give examples. This is an example of a person's position. It's last name and first name. And you see that the position is text wrapped. It reads across and then goes to the next row. Whereas if you were just to take the output from the commercial OCR software, just to read this from left to right, you would get it in the wrong order. And so we're essentially able to use the character level bounding boxes from Google Cloud Vision and the fact that this is classified as a personnel row to correctly wrap the text. And so you see now we're able to correctly order it and put the person's position and name together correctly using those bounding boxes. In some cases, Google Cloud Vision may not detect that there's variable names there that are circled. But we can see that there's an empty row. We recognized a row. They didn't recognize anything there. And we combine that with other information, the order in which variables appear. Regular expressions that match the fact that certain variables always have that format to infer what the variables should be, even though the software didn't detect it. And this is very important for us because we want to be able to analyze the net profits of the firm. And that way, we're able to extract that information. Sometimes Google Cloud Vision recognizes characters that aren't there. That's often indicated with a very low confidence score. So we can combine that with other pieces of information, like what format should a number have. It shouldn't have more than 3 digits to the right of a comma, and use that to figure out characters that Google Cloud Vision has detected that shouldn't be there at all. And we can pre-process and remove those. So in summary, there's a variety of pre-processing we do related to combining character level output from Google Cloud Vision into rows of the tables using our row level bounding boxes, getting rid of characters that shouldn't be there, et cetera. You see we go from symbol level data to row level data. Now we want to label the yellow rows that contain variable names. And the general structure is there's a variable name, then there may be a value in blue, and then there's another variable name, and those are variables we want for our analysis. We need to find them. We do that initially through using the semantic information. The details of that are not that important. But what is important is we're pretty permissive in identifying variable names. And now we generate a series of flags that allow us to remove the incorrect ones and infer the missing ones. And much of the heavy lifting, again, is going to be done by the structure of the tables. Not all firms have all variables, but if they have them, they appear in a particular order. And so again, we're going to create a variety of flags, the order, but also other things that we know should or shouldn't happen. Are there non-allowed characters in a variable? Et cetera, et cetera. So we create a variety of flags, and we can apply those to figure out which labels are wrong. And we're going to really, again, heavily use the order in which things appear. And so we know that variables should appear in a certain order, and we can label that order to create essentially an ordinal time series. When there's a huge jump there and then a spike down, that's indicative of a variable that's in the wrong order. And so we can use that to infer this is an incorrect match. That shouldn't be there. And we can combine that with other sources of information to be confident that we're correct. And this process is very successful. When we apply it all, we end up with essentially everything in the correct order, except for a few cases of human error in the book. So you can see initially those spikes, purple spikes, are indicative of variables that are in the wrong order. When we go through, combine those with other sources of information, remove it, we end up with a much more accurate labeling. And then we're able to infer missing variable names. And we do that in a variety of ways. Again, using the ordering is important. So here's a specific example, right? And so at the top, you have a counting period, but then there's an NA there. Google Cloud Vision didn't recognize something that it should have recognized, so we missed the variable name. But we see that characters that should not appear in the accounting period appear, and the accounting period is too long. It shouldn't take that many lines to say what the accounting period is. So we know that we've missed something. And we also know that the only variable that can appear between the accounting period and the next variable that we've labeled is net profits. And so even though Google Cloud Vision failed to recognize the name of that variable, we're able to fill that in. And we see indeed when we do that, that the variable value has the appropriate format. And so this visualizes the labeling changes that we make throughout the pipeline. The pinks are the changes. And this visualizes accuracy. And so the key thing is we've labeled data. The reds are incorrect, and the greens are correct. And you see we get much more correct as we move along the pipeline. OK, so I just have, OK, well, let me briefly summarize this. So essentially, we go from symbol level data to row level data. We match about 100,000 lines with variable names. We remove ones that are incorrect, add back in ones that are missing, and then we can reshape that and do some further data cleaning that's standard. OK, so I have about 5 minutes left, and I've shown you our method. So now I just want to briefly talk about the cloud platform we're designing, which hopefully will be useful for other people in their research. So no pipeline is going to be perfect, and software tools can help to facilitate error correction. And in this way, it's inefficient for each research team to reinvent the wheel. And moreover, open collaboration is useful because if we can see the errors that people are correcting in data that we've digitized, that helps us to infer where our pipeline is going wrong and where we can fix it in the future. And so we're working with an engineering firm to create an open source collaborative data platform that will allow users to upload digitized data and efficiently refine digitization and classification. And so this is an example of what it will look like. And you can see different publications that we've seen in the talk today here. And this is actually, it's functioning. You can go in and click on it. And you can search for things. And this platform has several features. You'll be able to search. It will have tools centrally for identifying and correcting digitization and classification errors. There'll be versioning and visualization. And so at the center are the tools to identify and correct potential errors. And importantly, you'll be able to view the digitized content side by side with the original image. And that will allow for the visualization of character level bounding boxes and confidence scores. So when you put your cursor over the cell of a table that's been digitized, you will see exactly where in the raw image it came from. And you can see shaded on that how confident the OCR software is in that character recognition, and use that to check the accuracy of the digitization, which may seem like a small thing, but you waste a huge amount of time going back to the original and looking if something's correct, so that greatly facilitates efficiency. There'll be change logs. We'll see the errors that users identify, and which can aggregate information across many different research teams about what's going right and what's going wrong with automated digitization. So this is a basic view of the data editor. But as I said, you'll be able to visualize bounding boxes and character confidence on it. Versioning, you can choose different versions of the data set that other researchers have edited. You can compare changes across versions of the data set. There'll also be an editor for correcting row labels, which will help us to improve our algorithms for classification. And more broadly, the goal is to engage the broader community. There'll be opportunities for researchers to incorporate their own digitized public domain content. We've had some researchers express an interest in running contests on the platform. They have content they want digitized, and then contests to find and correct errors. And so just to conclude, I've shown you a combination of methods to convert images of semi-structured and tabular data, which are frequently used in social science research, into classified databases. And these tools help to fill a major gap in the literature, which is a lack of methods for layout understanding. And these methods haven't been really developed because they're not very central to the digital humanities, where they tend to work with books. The commercial OCR software is trained on books, so it works relatively well. But for the type of data sets that we want to use as social scientists, we have very complicated layouts, we have sparse layouts, and so we need tools to recognize what those layouts are, to remove that sparsity and make it look like a book. I mean, maybe in 10 years, Google Cloud Vision will do better with sparse layouts, but in the meantime, I have papers that I want to write with data that's in hard copy, and so do a lot of other researchers, and so we hope that these tools will be generally useful to help digitize data that can elucidate a range of important social science questions. Thank you. Yes?
I guess I was, if you did a specific example of this Japanese set of data, a quick broad problem you're interested in. When you go to other cultures, other languages, other problems, are many of your tools still going to transfer over? Do you expect it to?
Yeah, so I think that in general, like the problems that we've identified, which is an inability to recognize layouts and sparsity, are very general. And in processing the image data, I mean, like the team of people that I've been working with who are here in the back, we have somebody, Yukako, who reads Japanese and helps us to label the data and check whether it's correct. But the rest of us are not Japanese speakers. Like the deep learning isn't using anything from Japanese. It's using data science methods. Is using the image data itself, and we think that's very transferable. So one case that I'd like to try in the near future is historical newspapers from the US, which there's tons of papers in social science on the media. They all just use keyword hits because you can't do much natural language processing if you can't get the layout right and the text right. And so I'd like to apply sort of these tools there, and we've scraped all that information. And I think that my instinct is that it's going to apply quite well because the layouts are very similar, the problems are similar, and there's nothing about kind of Japanese that per se that's causing these problems. We're having these problems because commercial OCR software can't recognize the layouts, and when it can't recognize the layouts, then it fails to detect where on the page the text is. And like I said, I've also tried putting historical US patent data in there, and you see the same problems.
You
Yep.
have to use say that much of the data that we care about are in tables, like some of the data that we care about are in graphs. And one could also think about extracting that from the image. I don't know if you thought about this. This is my first question. My second question is, like, when you are done with this, you have data, and then, you know, hopefully all that will be correct, but probably it's not going to be 100% correct. And they are like statistical tools about you know, outlier detection and so on. I don't know if you have been thinking about incorporating that as part of the platform.
Yep, so those are both great questions. So I agree that I think that more broadly, there are fascinating applications of computer vision tools to extracting data. So it could be from graphs, which is not a case that we've developed yet. And I mean, there's a little bit, like, I've seen a paper here and there. There's not much on that, but it's another area where there's a lot of potential. It could be from historical images. The CIA took 6 million spy photographs during the Cold War, and there's actually a lot of information in those that you could use computer vision tools to extract, and kind of the list goes on. And so I'd love to develop a lot of these applications more broadly, but just started here, since these seem to be really central sources of information. And then, yeah, on the second part, absolutely. And I didn't have time due to space constraints to really talk about the data cleaning that we do once you have the data at the firm level. But that's also important. I mean, so one thing we've done is just to go through and manually get the data and use that as a labeled data for validation. But we want to apply this to 30,000 firms collected every year. Obviously, you're not going to validate everything, and these statistical tools become very important. So that's definitely important and part of it as well. Yeah.
So how much manual work goes into this, and how much of this, the cleaning part, is still automated?
It's mostly automated, so most of the manual work is labeling, just because we do have so much data that we really can't do manual cleaning on everything because there's way too much. But we did want labeled data, you know, to train the models and then also to validate the accuracy and figure out what the problems are. And so the whole goal is really to minimize manual labor. Yeah.
One other, so apart from this statistical prediction quality, what would be interesting, I find, for application is to know, as someone who uses downstream this cloud platform, actually what sampling procedure lies behind this. This Japanese data, to me, sounds special, as you have it seems like a complete list of everything you have in this economy. And how would you go about documenting that this data also has a problem that at the time it was produced, it was, yeah, I think about spy photographs. Like, these show very specific, non-representative parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that, you know, being able to digitize the data doesn't tell you that it was high quality data at the time it was collected. It doesn't tell you anything about sort of the collection of the data, right? So that's always a super important question to think about, but that's something that we think about in the context of each specific project. I mean, so one thing that is related to sampling is I talked to some economic historians, and kind of their reaction is, well, why are you spending all this time doing this fancy data science stuff? Why don't you just take a sample and like send that off to the data entry firm and like do economic research? But of course, we know from a variety of research, for example, that if you want to study network relationships that we're interested in, that if you take a sample of a network and try to do analysis on that, that has very poor statistical properties. And so in some sense, having these methods does allow you to be more likely to get that complete enumeration and get around some of these sampling concerns. But of course, the concerns you have are going to depend on what data set you want to apply the methods to.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.